So how's it going?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind for you. You've been everywhere.
The third quarter is always my craziest.
So why
Fourth,
is that? Is it harvest season?
pardon me, yeah.
So tell me, Roy, my favorite icebreaker question. If you could invite one guest, living or dead, to a dinner party, who would you choose?
My choice would be Bartholomew Broadbent. He
Great
lives
choice.
in Virginia.
Yeah.
In 1994, I had been working for Marriott Corporation, and they divided the company into two. It was the first American company to do so. And I decided that instead of taking the promotion I was offered, because I had worked for them for a bunch of years at that point, I wound up writing to Bartholomew, knowing his reputation in the US. He was working for Premium Port Wines at the time. And his father was a very famous wine writer, started Christie's Wine Auctions, the first wine auctions in the world. And Bartholomew had moved from the UK to the US to start up the importership for the Symington family. So I wrote to him and asked him for some help in planning my trip to Portugal. And he was extremely helpful. And without him, my trip would never have been anywhere near as good. And the contacts that he helped me with in Portugal were life-changing.
I love that. I've actually connected with him over Instagram, believe it or not, the power of social media. So you're known as one of the leading port experts, really, I would argue, in the world. So tell me more about your journey into port wine. So from moving from Seattle, I believe it was, right, to Porto, and ultimately launching this port wine tourism business or wine tourism business, and even naming your daughter Taylor after one of the founding port houses. So tell me about what inspired you to get into port.
After that, I had started actually 40 years ago in the world of port. I was working at a restaurant in New York City, and we were at the time, this was 1983, we had on tap in one of the very earliest Cruganet systems in the USA at a restaurant called the Water Club in Manhattan. We had a 1963 Sandeman by the glass. And 40 years ago, that wasn't something that was very common, certainly not for port. Every time the Sam opened the bottle, he would call me in to help with the decanting, and then basically I'd get to take a sip just to see how it was. And that was my very earliest port experience, and I fell in love with it from the pretty much first time I ever tried it. Sandeman 63 was a great port to begin with, but I started trying others as well and started to collect a couple of years later. It wasn't until 94 that I actually got to go to Portugal. 11 years later, I had finally saved up enough money to be able to get to Portugal. And I spent 3 weeks with my girlfriend. We first went to Lisbon, then went up to Porto, spent a week in Porto, and then in the Douro another week. So it was, for me, the trip of a lifetime. Took me long enough to get over to Europe. I was 37 at the time, 26 when I was first drinking the ports. And immediately came back and started writing about port. I had been reading, that point I probably had read over 20 books on port. And at this point it's 60 to 70 books that I've read on port.
Wow. Yeah.
Pretty much most that have ever been published in the English language. And in 2003, based on my writing, about port wine and Madeira to a lesser extent, but port was the majority of what I was writing about at the time. I wound up being inducted into the Port Wine Brotherhood. And I was the second American that year in 2003 that had been brought into the Brotherhood. So I felt honored, pretty much came back and started writing full time, quit my day job, and started writing about port full time.
Well, it's pretty niche. I can't imagine there were many port wine writers covering the category. Even now, it's very rare to even find coverage about port wine.
It's not a very popular topic in terms of writing, but there's probably a half dozen people who really focus on port.
So you're the go-to guru on all things port wine. And this leads into kind of my next question about American experience. And you lead a tourism business, which you launched in 2005, I believe. And you reacquainted people and introduced them to port wine, which is really interesting. And what would you tell someone who is totally new to the category and perhaps even intimidated to try it? How do you get them on board with port? What's the selling point and how should they experience it?
I think that port is, there's a lot of people say, I don't like port, I don't like sweet wines, I don't drink dessert wines, until they try one. And I have found so many people who, when it comes to tours or whatever, pretty much said, you know, I don't want to drink port. And then I watch them try it. And most people say, yeah, that's really great. I didn't know I liked port. I didn't think I liked sweet wine. This is really good. And it's not as sweet as I thought it was going to be. So I think it appeals to many more people than are aware of their propensity to enjoy dessert wines. Port itself has a ton of different categories. And so people basically think of the ruby ports, LBD, and vintage ports, but there are white ports, aged white ports. There are all kinds of different wood age ports, from colheitas, which are single year tawny ports. All the grapes come from a single harvest. And then there are tawny ports, which are 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 years old, and are blends that replicate what a vintage port would be like at the same age. The US really came into focus in the mid-1990s. Cigar Aficionado magazine became popular. And at that time, so around 96, 97, when the 1994 vintage first became extremely popular in the United States, I give full credit to Cigar Aficionado for changing the mindset. It was also a boom time in terms of the financial world. Both the advertising industry in the United States, Wall Street was going bonkers. It was a good time for port to get really set in the US. And for the first time in history, vintage port and port in general was purchased in larger volume than in the UK.
Wow.
And I think that was 1996, the first time, and the last time that a vintage, which was 94, ever surpassed the UK. Really was the 90s, where in America that it started to become known. You know, and it wasn't really popular yet, but over the last 25, 30 years, it's really changed. And now I wouldn't say it's a mainstay or mainstream, but you find restaurants all over the US that have it on their dessert wine lists, along with Madeira, which is more shelf stable. But port is really come a long way. It's not just paired with dessert, nowadays you can find it where there are places, I know people who drink port, for example, with fried chicken, sushi,
That's interesting.
a lot of interesting pairings that you can have port. I have friends who drink nothing but port. I would never do that as much as I love port. And there are drier styles. Not all of
Right.
it is sweet. There's dry whites. There are what's called medium sweet and medium dry. So there's a range of it, as well as super sweet ones called Lagrima, and so the tears. So there are many different categories of ports for people to try. You had mentioned about my daughter, and I never answered your question.
You named her Taylor after Taylor Port, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Get back to that for a second. She was born in 2002.
Okay.
Actually, it is her 21st birthday today.
Oh, congratulations. And you're on the podcast with me. You should go celebrate. Is she still in the US though?
She's in New York City,
Yeah,
yes.
that's what I
So
thought.
she's going to be having a great night, finally legal and able to drink her wine, which she
Amazing.
really enjoys.
Does she enjoy port? I feel like she has to.
She started drinking port at a very young age, sipping port, I should say, not even drinking it. But when I left the US and moved here a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, I should say, at the end of COVID, I wound up leaving her 40 cases of my port so that she had enough to drink pretty much the rest of her life, or as long
A
as
lifetime supply.
yeah, enough to get started, that's for sure.
What's her perception of port wine? Obviously, she's grown up around it with you, but what does
Yeah.
she think?
She likes it. She's tried mostly vintage ports. At 2 years and 4 months, she decanted by herself her very first bottle of port, standing on a little stool in our kitchen.
So getting back to Americans, and I know in our initial conversation, Roy, we had chatted about kind of the best entry level port wine for Americans. And your answer was very different than the Portuguese answer. I've talked to port producers in Portugal who came up with very different answers. And you being an American living in Porto, what's your response to that? The best entry level for Americans getting into port for the first time?
It's easy for a port geek or port snob or whatever to look at port very differently than someone who's trying it for their first time. And I always try to get people started with not just basic ruby ports, but LBV. Because vintage ports are somewhat expensive comparatively. 3 times the cost. Your average LBV, let's say, is about $25. And today, vintage ports, when they're released, are about 75 on average in the United States.
And can you explain, just break it down to for listeners, late bottle LBV, late bottle vintage. So tell us a little bit more about that style.
So an LBV is kept in wood from 4, 5, or 6 years, depending on the producer. And some have recipes where it's always 4 years. Others decide, let the grapes speak for themselves. I'm going to pick a name out of the sky. Quinta de Crasta. They decide, okay, this year, our LBV is going to sit in wood for 4 years. This year, 6. Next year, let's wait and see what it is, and maybe that one's 5. So I like that. Let the grapes do the deciding how much wood it needs. They sit in the wood. The wood is neutral and gives no flavor, imparts a little bit of color, but not much else because they're neutral casks. And at that point, they are then bottled and wind up going in bottle. If they're filtered, they're meant to be consumed immediately. If they're unfiltered, and most of the Portuguese ones are unfiltered, they wind up being able to have some sediment in the bottle, which requires decanting, but they age in bottle quite nicely. Even 20, 30 years is not uncommon for those that like that style and prefer to have more mature wines. The ports can age easily like a vintage port. Again, far more expensive, but they age, the LBVs at 20 years of age are incredible. But you can drink them at 4, 5, or 6 years of age as soon as they're bottled. Some companies let them bottle age for another 4 years, Smith Woodhouse, for example, and they will release them literally 8 years after the harvest, 4 of which it sat in wood, and then 4 years in bottle before it hits the marketplace. I love that kind of style because you're then getting something at the same exact price with 8 years of total age, and they show differently. They're more complexity, but they're rubies in style. They're still ruby colored garnet to a lighter pale red, depending on how much age they have to them. They're delicious. They have very a lot of red fruits, purple plum type of essence. Wish I was drinking port right now.
Grab a bottle behind you, Roy.
And so the LBVs offer great value, and they can age. They can gain in complexity in bottle, which is a real bonus. So there's 3 different major categories, just completely different in style.
And you had mentioned, because I asked about the palate, the American palate, what's most appealing port wine wise, and you had mentioned tawnies because of the bourbon connection. And as Americans, of course, our palate is so attuned to those kind of oaky, aged in cask flavors. And so are you still seeing like the popularity of tawnies among Americans too?
I'm just going to take a step back for a second. Yes, but I'm going to touch on what happened in the UK even first. Okay. So the UK was drinking just vintage ports for years and years, and Americans were getting into tawnies. And when the British were coming over to the United States, they were introduced to colhetas to some degree. They had them obviously in their own country. But the collectors in the United States, the people who were really getting more serious about port, moved into tawnies and colhetas, the single year tawnies, single harvest tawnies, excuse me. And so over time, America really started to move into the tawny realm. There are port clubs that have sprung up all over the United States, which regionally, as far away as Wisconsin on both coasts, Florida, DC, Jersey, New York, there are 2. They're all over the US. Seattle has a couple. And so it's become much more widespread. There is a lot more port consumed in the US than at any point, except that moment in '94 it was vintage. Now I think tawnies are much more popular. I'm not saying more popular than vintage, but more popular than they have ever been in years. There are more new port companies that have come on board than probably the last 2 centuries.
So let's dive into that and unpack that a little bit more, because I know you had mentioned when you first moved to Porto, Porto has become a world-class city, to your point, in the past few decades. It's become a really popular tourist destination. My in-laws were actually just there recently and had a great time. But what other influences aside from tourism are contributing to port wine's popularity, especially among Americans?
None.
So it's tourism? You have to bring people over to try it?
Tourism has grown, and I'm just going to touch on my tours. I don't want to push my own agenda here,
Go
but
for it.
I will mention them quickly. In 2005, I started up a tour company and had a Portuguese partner who had worked for years in America as basically the liaison between the Port Wine Institute, which is the IVDP nowadays, because they also regulate table wines as well as port. And so the two of us started out with 2 guests in 2005 during the port harvest. And now we generally have between 12 and 16 guests per tour. We never go with more than 16 because of the size of the pours we're able to accommodate our guests with and the number of ports they're going to drink in a week. And it is grown to the point where this year we had 4 private tours and 4 of our own tours. Prior to this, we had never really, 5 years ago, we were doing 2 and 3 tours a year. And it's even during the rush during COVID to do tours, people were saying, as soon as this goes away, we're going to come to Portugal. We're dying to get out of the country. We've heard how great Portugal is, and we really want to see it. And I said, well, it doesn't have to be port. We also go to Madeira. We do 13 of Portugal's 14 wine regions. We do table wine tours. We do island adventure tours where we go to the Azores and Madeira. We do full week-long tours, and we let people create their own tours. If they want to bring a group of friends and create their own tour where we go to multiple regions or focus just in one part of Portugal, we'll do that for them. But our essence has always been Douro and port, and still is. I love it here in Portugal. The tourism factor has grown exponentially in the last decade. From about 2010, it was still sleepy, and we had been doing tours for several years at that point. 2019, it maxed. I mean, it hit an all-time high, and then COVID came. Portugal, American tourists came here in larger numbers for the first time ever than in Italy or France, which is mind-blowing. There's only 9 here. Italy and France have been #1 and #2 destination back and forth for 40 years of record keeping. And Portugal in 2022, for the first time ever, blew both of them off the map in Europe.
I love that. It's helping port wine's cause. Thanks for listening to Drink Port, a podcast from Starboard. Interested in being featured? Visit starboardwine.com/podcast to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter so you can join the venture to a new port. Cheers and drink port.